take it away. I'm excited to be here. My name is Wendy Caldwell. I'm the executive director of the Monarch joint venture, and happy to take this last little bit of the conference here to talk about the status and conservation of monarch butterflies. The Monarch joint venture is a national conservation partnership. We have now over 100 organizations all over the US, ranging from local volunteer-led groups to federal natural resource agencies. And we work with these partners in a variety of capacities, from science and monitoring, education, to on-the-ground habitat conservation, and really just cultivating this network of partners who are working together for the collective vision of monarch butterfly conservation. Organized under a North American Monarch Conservation Plan that was put out in 2008 by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, we focus on the US-based actions that we can take to do our part in conservation of this trinational migratory species. And so we prepare with our partners a conservation implementation plan that really hones in on those priorities. So I wanted to take just a little bit before diving in to share this monarch butterfly as a flagship for broader conservation benefits. So we really look at the iconic monarch butterfly as a flagship, as a tool to help in our conservation objectives that are helping to alleviate a whole suite of environmental concerns. It has this charisma and ability to capture the hearts and minds of a wide variety of audiences. And so the work that we do for monarchs really is a flagship for much broader conservation benefits. Just a quick recap of monarch, the individual life cycle and the annual life cycle before we get into some conservation bits. Remember that monarch butterflies undergo complete metamorphosis, so they have an egg, a caterpillar, a pupa, and an adult stage. So they spend about 3 to 5 days as an egg on a milkweed plant, about 2 weeks as a larva, another 10 days as a chrysalis, and then as an adult, there are breeding generations that live about a month on average, and an overwintering generation that can live up to 9 months. So that migration piece, I'm going to go through this quickly. It's a little bit complicated, but it's this multi-generational annual cycle. And so just to provide this context of our conservation efforts require us thinking about monarchs' needs in different areas of their annual cycle. And so starting with this first generation of offspring, these are the eggs that are laid in the southern US from those that have traveled north from overwintering in Mexico. And then we see generations 2, 3, and 4 occupied this northern part of the range from May through August. And then that fourth generation, the migratory generation, this is the one that can live up to 9 months, migrates south in one generation, arriving at the overwintering colonies in Mexico right around early November. And then those butterflies spend the entire winter there and begin that migration north. So you can see how this multi-generational cycle makes conservation for a species like the monarch a little bit more complicated, because they have different needs in these different sections of their annual life cycle. Threats to monarchs, I don't think any of this would be a surprise to this audience, but I just wanted to kind of reiterate the interactions of these various threats that have caused monarch populations to decline. Kind of a main cause of monarch populations decline have been habitat loss, both at their overwintering grounds and throughout their breeding range. Pesticides are impacting monarchs. I mean, you've probably heard the news from things like the recent mosquito spray application that killed monarchs during their fall migration. Climate change is becoming an increasingly severe factor as we're seeing more severe and more frequent climate change issues like severe storms in Mexico that wipe out huge sections of the population while they're overwintering there, or drought conditions somewhere along their migratory route that impact the nectar availability for monarchs as they're migrating. And certainly monarchs, like everything else, have natural enemies and diseases that they face. So in North America, we look at really two kind of main distinct populations, those east of the Rocky Mountains and those west of the Rocky Mountains. So I'll share with you kind of the status of both of them. Starting with the eastern population, whose migration I just described. We just heard last week, actually, the total number for butterflies that were measured at the overwintering sites in Mexico, and it was a decline of 26% from last year, down to 2.1 hectares of forest occupied in these mountainous areas of central Mexico. And 6 hectares is the goal. That's the target. That's where we want to be. That's the size of the population, the eastern population, where we could be relatively confident that they could overcome severe weather situations, or they could be able to handle those threats that I just talked about. And so we're well below that threshold of where we want to be to feel confident that the population size is sustainable. In order to get to that population size, the research and the modeling is projecting that we need to add an additional 1.4 billion milkweed stems on the landscape. And so that's a lot of milkweed. And I would just add the caveat that it isn't just about milkweed. It's about milkweed embedded in diverse grassland habitat. The western population is in much more of a dire state. The numbers this year, the past 2 years of overwintering counts in the west. These butterflies migrate to the coast of California and spend the winter there at several hundred locations in much smaller groupings than the ones in central Mexico. And so you can see on this chart that top line represents the total number of sites monitored. So what makes the western decline even more interesting is that we were monitoring more sites, but still seeing fewer butterflies. And so even after 2 record low population size of, just under 30,000 butterflies, this past year, the population crashed and they counted less than 2,000 butterflies on the coast of California. And so while monarchs in the east are also really vulnerable at this point, the western population is incredibly in trouble, and we have to respond really quickly in order to to continue to have hope for recovering the western migration. So to give you a goal where we're wanting to be in the west, the goal for this population size is a 5-year running average of 500,000 butterflies. So that's, right now we have few enough butterflies overwintering along the coast that could fit on a single tree, and 2,000 butterflies compared to the 500,000 that we're striving for. To do that, we definitely need to protect the known overwintering locations, at least 50% of the known and active overwintering locations, but 90% of the most important ones. And in addition to that, actively maintaining a minimum of 50,000 additional acres of monarch habitat in California's Central Valley and the adjacent foothills. This is really kind of a key area that we can focus efforts on, focus efforts on this year. This is just that main priority area, this light blue area where monarchs that are moving inland from the coast, this is their first stopover site. This is where they're breeding. This is what's going to potentially help rebound the population. So if we can get as much effort underway in this light blue region this year, that's going to give monarchs the best hope of recovering the migration in the west. Switching gears, I wanted to talk a little bit about endangered species listing. So as you are probably aware, monarchs were petitioned to be listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 2014. And so several things have happened since then. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service found that monarchs did warrant further assessment. And so then they started to undergo a species status assessment from 2015 to 2018. They launched what's called the Monarch Conservation Database to gather information about the activities, the conservation activities that were underway or planned, that groups, conservation groups and landowners had been taking on. Originally, the listing decision was due in June of 2019, but then that got delayed. And so the listing decision came out just in this past December of 2020. Ultimately, the three decision options were that monarchs could be warranted for listing, they could be not warranted, and then the process would end, or they could be warranted but precluded by other higher priority actions. And this final listing warranted but precluded is what the decision was. To give you just one kind of piece of the puzzle of that species status assessment, for insects, for invertebrates, the Fish and Wildlife Service has to evaluate the species as a whole. It can't list distinct population segments. And so because monarchs have global distribution, that's one of the reasons that they couldn't per se list the Western subpopulation or population segment separately from the rest of the species. And so that's one kind of complicating factor of the Endangered Species Act when it comes to invertebrates, species like monarch butterflies. So where we're going from here, the Fish and Wildlife Service as a warranted but precluded finding, monarchs now become a candidate species, and so they're heightened in attention in terms of planned conservation efforts. The Fish and Wildlife Service will continue to collect information about efforts through the Monarch Conservation Database. So that's definitely something, if you're not familiar, making sure that we're communicating to the service what conservation is underway that's helping, that is intended for monarchs and pollinators. This is a place to do that. There's also an app called Habitally, which helps to streamline that process. Landowners can use that app to report the monarch conservation projects that they've done. And then an annual review is expected. So as a candidate species, the service is required to reevaluate that priority. So right now, monarchs are behind 8 other species that will be reviewed for listing first. And so they do an annual check-in on that priority to make sure that the situation hasn't gotten worse. And so they look at that annually. And then right now, the service is expecting to list monarchs in 2024 after they get through this queue of other species that are of higher priority. I also wanted to mention that now as a candidate species, there are tools and that can help with landowner assurances or other sectors that are involved in conservation, or we hope to get more involved in conservation. There's a tool called the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. One of these has already been established for monarchs on energy and transportation lands. And so this is a tool that the service can use as an agreement between whatever entity, whether it's a landowner or a broader group, that can agree upon practices that give them some regulatory assurances for when the species eventually becomes listed. I wanted to share this research, I think, just to paint a picture for how we get there. How do we get to our monarch conservation goals? And really what it comes down to is all hands on deck. So this graph that you're seeing with the red circles. All these different colored dots represent different sectors or different combinations of sectors and various adoption rates, various levels of engagement and involvement in how much that particular sector might be able to contribute to monarch butterfly conservation. And so I highlighted with circles the agricultural sector and all hands on deck. So what that's showing you is that basically in order to reach that 6-hectare target, agriculture has a really large ability to influence monarch butterfly, our goals at getting that many milkweed stems on the landscape to help monarch butterflies recover. And so it's really not until we engage all hands on deck that we actually reach that target. So our goal in monarch conservation is really to engage all of these sectors across agricultural lands, rights of way, developed areas, public lands, conservation lands. We need all of it. We need habitat anywhere and everywhere we can get it. And so what does that look like? Kind of the call to action here is certainly here in the Midwest, we don't have as much of a direct ability to influence the overwintering areas, but that's an important part of the conservation strategy. We need to restore, our role is much more in restoring breeding and migratory habitats that include a diversity of nectar resources, but also native milkweed host plants, because without milkweeds, we won't have monarchs. We need to make sure that those habitats that we're encouraging are protected, making sure that they're as successful and productive as possible for monarchs. We need to do a lot more population and habitat monitoring so we can understand responses to different practices and just have a good sense of how the population is doing. We need to do habitat effectiveness monitoring, which is something we're starting to do more of with our integrated monarch monitoring program, basically looking at what practices are we implementing and how effective are they at creating monarch habitat from both a vegetation and habitat perspective, but also from a monarch use perspective. And so we have the tools to start to understand that and to collect data in a consistent, standardized fashion. We need to do a lot more education and community engagement to get more and more people, really truly embrace this all hands on deck approach at conservation. We need to support monarch and pollinator friendly legislation and changing some local ordinances to shift this culture of manicured lawns, making sure that people are embracing that and understanding the value that monarchs and other pollinators bring to the landscape. I'll talk a little bit more on a future slide, but also kind of this message of keeping monarchs wild. So all that to say, plant native and plant now. We have I just wanted to make brief mention of a management chart that we have, basically grouping the latitudes of the country and looking at the timing of monarchs. So as you're thinking about management activities, you're not going to be able to time it for every bird or insect or turtle out there, but I think there are tools that are available to help influence, like if you're monitoring or if you're managing for monarchs, here are important timings of where managing that, whether it's burning or mowing, might have less impact on the monarchs that are there currently using that space. And so it's just kind of balancing those management objectives that you have, whatever specific group of wildlife that you might be managing for. So just keeping that timing in mind. This handout is available on our website. I just wanted to address, because I think this is a question that comes up a lot and an interest that comes up a lot in monarch conservation as people get more involved. They really want to bring, less than 10% of the eggs that are laid survive to adulthood. So that drives people to want to bring monarchs inside and rear them to save them. And so we've developed some another handout and some reasons why or why not to rear monarchs. And so there's huge value in monarchs as an educational tool. People rear monarchs and contribute that information to community science projects, and also just because they love to do it. And so if it's from an enjoyment perspective, we encourage people to do it in a small scale way, not necessarily for the purposes of conservation. Really what's going to be most impactful for monarchs is to focus that energy on getting more habitat on the landscape. Why not? There are several complicating factors why we discourage people from rearing large numbers of monarchs. In California, for one, it's illegal. It's not illegal in all states, but it definitely is in California, and so there are some legal concerns. Monarchs are also, rearing them can actually increase the disease prevalence, because they don't always look sick, but then all of a sudden, when you're rearing monarchs in high numbers, and if you don't have the right rearing procedures in place, then people actually end up inadvertently spreading disease and doing the exact opposite of what they're trying to do. And other factors for why rearing monarchs is not, which I won't get into much, but so really, I guess the take home here is rear in small numbers, and if you do rear, contribute to community science programs, and use it as a tool to engage people to get involved in conservation. Here are some of the main community science programs that people can get involved with, anywhere from sampling adult butterflies for protozoan parasite to, with Project Monarch Health, to just reporting when and where you see monarchs through Journey North, to going out on a weekly basis for the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, and giving back reports of what you see, what egg and caterpillar observations you make on a week-to-week basis at a site. And then finally, for Monarch Watch, tagging in the fall. So there are lots of different ways to plug into gathering data for monarchs, and it's just a great way to engage the community. And then if we take that to kind of the next level up of scientific rigor, we run the integrated Monarch monitoring program that kind of incorporates many of those protocols, and then also adds a more significant habitat, vegetation, and management piece. And so this has become a really important tool for us in understanding that adaptive management framework of what practices are we putting on the ground, and then how is that actually influencing, is it effective? And so then as this program grows, we'll be able to then further refine our conservation strategies moving forward. So I think I would leave that with a sense of monarchs are in trouble, but there is hope. There's so much going on. There are so many grassroots efforts, and monarchs just have this charisma. And as much as the population decline is devastating, it's really mobilizing a conservation movement that I think that we need to take advantage of and continue to grow. So I'd leave with a thought of there's definitely hope. With that,